Hey, everybody, welcome to this very first episode of The Owl Factor. I'm Oliver Libby, your host. I'm the co-founder of HL Ventures, a venture capital firm and studio based here in New York City, and also of the Resolution Project, a global accelerator for student social entrepreneurs working in about 82 countries and all across the US. So you could say I've spent my life at the nexus of leadership, trust, and entrepreneurship, helping young people start the very companies that express their visions and express their leadership around the world and across our country. On the Owl Factor, we discuss leadership and trust, which are two things that are intimately linked. You could say that the world has been in somewhat of a trust crisis that's been getting worse and worse over time. Without trust, you can't have leadership, but leadership doesn't work unless you earn the trust of people. And there are so many shades and elements to this that will make for really interesting conversations throughout the Owl Factor. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Sally Susman, who is a true leader and someone who lives out leadership and trust as part of her daily life and her achievements throughout an extraordinary career. Today, she's the Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Pfizer. She is the chair of the Pfizer Foundation and co-chair of Pfizer's Political Action Committee, and a leader of all of the external stakeholders overseeing global policy, communications, government relations, investor relations, and even the Chief Patient Office. I guess you could say that Sally has her hands in so much of what makes Pfizer a special company. Before joining the company in 2007, Sally held roles at the Estee Lauder Companies and American Express. And earlier in her career, she was for 8 years in government service, focused on international trade issues. So she also has a cross-sectoral background that we'll talk about today. Sally serves on the board of WPP, a global leader in advertising and marketing, and also is the co-chair of the board of the International Rescue Committee, doing amazing work around the world. So Sally, you've lived a life of leadership and trust already. I'm so glad to have you here. Let me first ask, how are you today?
Oh, I'm great, thanks. Excited to be here talking with you, Oliver. Thank you.
Oh, Sally, thanks so much for spending the time with us and our audience. So let me dive right into our first question. You are in the lead on some extremely important parts of Pfizer's culture and global impact. In fact, you steward all of the social impact and corporate responsibility around the company. And I want to start with the trust that you build internally and how you get buy-in in these important priorities within Pfizer.
Well, I'm very fortunate to be at Pfizer, where what we do is so in the public eye. It's at the forefront of healthcare. It's something people feel deeply about, and we're closely regulated. So within Pfizer, there's almost a natural, innate understanding that what we do as bridge builders to important stakeholder communities, creating trust, is not a nice to have, but a really essential function.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you just a quick dive in on that, which is, as you're bringing people along within the company, are there certain strategies that you use to ensure that the people within Pfizer's community view these priorities as their own?
Great question. I've worked in 3 large companies, and one of the most important things that we do as executives and leaders, I think, is really to understand the culture. And when friends ask me, should I join this company or that company, I always say, when you're in there, can you hear the music playing in the background? And what I mean by that is, it's not a place, not interested, can you get a job there? Would you survive there? But will you thrive there? And in order to thrive in an organization, I think takes a few things. First is a real love of the mission, a deep understanding of the mission. Ours is breakthroughs that change patients' lives. That's why I came to Pfizer. And then also, do you understand how it works? No one is going to follow your lead if they don't feel that you deeply understand how the company works. And when I was at American Express, that meant, how do the finances flow? What do we do for card members? What do we do for merchants? And here at Pfizer, it's a very complex healthcare system. Globally, you have to really build your expertise. And then lastly, you have to spend time with people and listen to them and talk with them and sweat their worries and, care alongside their caring for what they're trying to do and be a part of that team. And I think those are the kinds of steps that create a mutual reinforcing bond among executives. And then I help them and they help me.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, knowing you for as many years as I do, I know that you have been actually embodying those values in everything that you do. So speaking of improving lives, I want to I want to talk a little bit about the impact that Pfizer has had very recently on people's lives. And in fact, Pfizer's been in our lives, and in fact, in my left arm twice in recent weeks, and I'm very thankful for it. And so you've been improving lives in this really important way. And let me say, the science is nothing less than historic. The achievement of cutting down the timeline and producing such a great life-saving vaccine is extraordinary. But second to the science, it must have also been extraordinarily challenging to manage all the key stakeholders in something like this. And Sally, I know you were at the forefront of that. Can you talk a little bit about what it must have been like and the strategies that you used to build trust between all the different stakeholders across sectors, the government, the corporate world, the media, individuals? How did you collaborate and create trust across such a great group of people for this historic achievement?
Thank you. It's a great question. And first, let me just say how happy I am to know that you've been vaccinated and that you can enjoy that feeling of protection and liberation that comes with that. So that's fantastic news. To answer your question, I really need to give credit to my boss, Pfizer CEO, Albert Bourla, when he set this, what was at the time considered a pretty crazy idea that we would bring forward a vaccine in 8 months rather than 8 to 12 years, what he called making the impossible possible. Lots of colleagues were engaged, but there were a couple of core functions that were drawn into the room. So as you say, of course, that's scientists, our manufacturing people who had to figure out how to produce this novel technology and create large number of doses, our regulatory team, all of our clinical trial experts. But I was also in the room, and that was very meaningful because we knew that not only did we want to bring forward a breakthrough vaccine, we needed to do so in a way that built trust and engendered confidence. I mean, imagine how tragic it would have been if we came up with this amazing vaccine, but no one had the faith in taking it. So from day one, I was thinking about what do I need to do and what do I need to do differently? So one thing is we became far, far more transparent. For example, we posted the clinical trial protocols on our website. I mean, that's intellectual property like gold. And normally we would treasure it and keep it private, but we didn't want to be having that debate about how do you run your clinical trial. We wanted to be fully forthcoming. Another key thing was accessibility. So we were open pretty much 24/7 to take questions from everybody. I heard from teachers groups, I heard from restaurateurs, I heard from all kinds of different and new stakeholders for us, of people who wanted to understand, and we were always available, including we heard from presidents, prime ministers, kings, people wanting to secure doses for their people, and we just took those calls. We didn't delay, we didn't hide. And I think really the key factors were a combination of transparency and availability.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. That's great advice. And from a pizza parlor to a king taking those calls, that really demonstrates some extraordinary range. So let me ask you, oftentimes when you're managing key relationships and building trust, sometimes those relationships are between people or organizations that are at odds. Some examples I can think of right now are, oftentimes the media, perhaps well-meaning, has to find something that sells and that's controversial. But in the same moment, the government, for example, really wants people to adopt the vaccine and to trust it. And those seem to be key rules that are at odds. And so perhaps I have two questions for you. The first is, do you have any tips or strategies for managing relationships between stakeholders that are at odds? And second of all, as you're thinking about increasing the marginal number of people who are trusting and comfortable with the vaccine, what are some of the strategies that you're employing to increase that number and make sure that people are taking advantage of this life-saving treatment?
Okay, that was like a 5-point compound question. You've got it in there. I'll do my best. So, I guess the first thing is that, of course, conflicts and antagonism are often at the epicenter of what people like to talk about. This was an unusual circumstance during the pandemic because we declared our only enemy is the virus. And maybe, our competitors became collaborators. With all due respect to antitrust laws, we still found ways to work together. And it was a kind of collaboration across the industry that I'd never seen before. And people really united, and even the media united around enemies like fear, isolation, loneliness, illness, death, all the terrible outcomes of the virus. So that really became the focal point. I think also embedded in your question is, well, but where do we go from here with that? Are people now going to criticize? And certainly the biggest criticism that we hear is whether or not doses are getting to people who are, not as able to afford them as some of the first world countries. And this has been on our mind from the beginning. Equity is one of Pfizer's 4 corporate values. And we have been working with the Gates Foundation, with COVAX, which is a facility for getting donations out to low and middle income countries. And many of those leaders I talked about before were leaders from, some of the poorest nations in the world. And what we're really doing is working with them to make vaccines available, at a not-for-profit basis. We have been, made a public commitment of 2 billion doses for low and middle income countries in the next 2 years, and working with the countries of the first world to ensure that we share the wealth. I mean, you and I are now talking at a point where supply exceeds demand in the US. And so the US has not been a big exporter of vaccines, and we need to become a bigger exporter. The US, it's interesting, has exported about 2% of their vaccines. Europe has exported close to 50% of their vaccines. So, yeah, I mean, these are discussions that are happening as we speak. Let me hit on the one other point I caught in your complex question, and that is about people who are fearful to take the vaccine. And we all know that no one is really safe until everyone is safe. And so we need to get the vaccination rates up. We need to reach herd immunity. But I believe, and this goes to my core as essentially a communicator, Oliver, is that we cannot demonize people who are not taking the vaccine. I don't use or like the phrase anti-vaxxer. I think that people who don't take the vaccine perhaps are fearful, had a bad experience with the medical profession, are skeptical, perhaps with good reasons. So what we're trying to do is listen, understand, make our messages and messengers tailored to reach some of the hardest reached communities.
Absolutely, Sally. And I really love what you said about messages and messengers. That's incredibly insightful. I want to talk about the fact that you are one of the top corporate leaders, and in fact, just plain leaders in every respect on diversity and inclusion. You're world renowned in this, and this is a really challenging and incredibly timely topic. I want to ask you and especially, by the way, in the context of what happened last year with George Floyd and the social justice movements, how is it that you are building diversity and inclusion into a core strategy? And particularly, how do you build it both into the day-to-day as a regular and core part of a large corporation's culture, but also how do you handle this really important topic in a time of crisis when it's incredibly present and timely in people's everyday lives?
Oh, thank you for raising that question. It's such an important one. And the nicest thing that you said to me, among all the nice things you said now, is that I'm a doer, because that's what I actually think is the heart of the answer. We are now at roughly the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And what we were asking ourselves last summer is, how can we make sure that this is not just a moment, but a movement? And not just the latest horrific thing we've seen and then move on, but to keep it with us. So what I try to do is raise the conversation around racism or sexism or homophobia regularly, not just when something flares and offends us, but bring it up in my town halls, in my conversations with my colleagues. And then I also believe that sometimes the answer can be found in simple steps. And I want to be a doer. So, for example, I changed some of the bylaws around our political action giving to make certain, we used to say our guideposts were pro-innovation, pro-patient policies, but I made it pro-innovation, pro-patient, and making sure that no one who received our funds had ever had hate speech or any kind of racist actions. And so my point really is not about the political action committee so much as it is about doing things, not just talking about things, but doing things, asking questions, keeping conversation front of mind. Whatever realm you're in, taking action within your realm to make sure that you're doing everything you can and to try your hardest to beat back the scourge of racism.
Thank you, Sally, for those wise words that we should all be contemplating, particularly now, incredibly relevant and timely. I want to start an Owl Factor tradition with you, which we're going to do with every episode in the future, which is to end on some leadership precepts, Sally, that you have found really meaningful and helpful for you. Something that I want to be useful to our listeners and our guests as they take forward your wisdom from the many years of your leadership and the many years that you have yet to give. So let me ask it directly. What are 2 or 3 leadership precepts that have stood you in good stead in your leadership and that perhaps have helped you build trust in the communities that you are managing and bringing into partnership and collaboration?
Well, again, thank you for giving me the honor of being your inaugural guest. I look forward to watching many more guests and being a part of this dialogue going forward. I would say just a couple of things. I never would have believed that being a communicator could be so essential to being a leader. And so I really encourage all present and future leaders to hone your communication skills, to really be able to express yourself, whatever it is you want to convey. And of course, the important corollary in communication is listening and trying to be a good listener and not only listening, but hearing what people are saying. And then final point always is to be brave. I mean, why not? We get one chance and let's do everything we can.
Absolutely, Sally. Well, before we go, I want to just tease out a few of the really relevant and awesome things that you have shared with us today. First of all, going all the way back to your first answer, you talked about sweating the problems and really listening to the people who are around you in your organization and in those that you're trying to work with. I think that's incredibly important. You talked about, and in fact, you just embody a level of authenticity, which I think is a critical component of building trust. And that's something we should all keep in mind and really believe in the things that we're trying to put forth and trying to build. You talked a lot about transparency, and taking a personal moment, my family comes from the scientific world, and it was stunning to see Pfizer under your leadership put the entire study design for the vaccine out in the public. That is truly unusual, and it's an extraordinary contribution to science and to humanity, but also a really important step in terms of building transparency and saying, look, here's our work. And then, of course, you've talked a lot today about shared purpose and how important it is to build that. I really enjoyed the distinction that you made and the link you made between messages and messengers. And in fact, the messengers that are out there delivering the messages that you're creating that make this trust possible. So maybe I'll ask it in the form of a question. How is it that you make sure that the right messengers are in the right places as this work is going forward?
Sure. And like most questions, I really like to use data whenever I can. So we did some polling around messengers as it related to vaccine confidence. And it was fascinating, Oliver. First of all, it's not celebrities, it's not politicians when it comes to building vaccine confidence. It's usually someone near to hand, a preacher, a teacher, a nurse, a neighbor. And so that was really enlightening for me. And, we have therefore provided simple information, basic messages and talking points, knowing that this is not something that people are going to hear on a TV ad or over a loudspeaker, but that there are quiet conversations happening all across the globe, where friend to friend, sister to brother, mother to son, people are talking about taking the vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. In fact, we'll be talking, I'm sure, in future L Factor episodes about the Edelman, the global PR firm's trust barometer. They're focused exactly on those very local relationships and small relationships where trust is built as well, and especially in an environment where institutional trust is being eroded. It's exactly those relationships that are going to matter the most. So I want to focus us in just on one last thing. We're in an era where there's so much in terms of big themes, superhero movies, the Avengers and all that. And I want to focus everyone on the way that you ended your comments, which is to focus on not demonizing people and on expressing your own bravery. That's the kind of positivity, the kind of authenticity that builds trust. And I admire that. And I think it's incredibly important to put that into the world. So Sally, without further ado, I just want to thank you so much for helping us kick off the Owl Factor. I want to thank you and everybody at Pfizer for doing the life-saving work that you've done. I probably, it's very personal for me, having had the vaccine, and for my wife and family, but it's incredibly important, and you couldn't have done it without expressing leadership and trust and the nexus between those two things. So everybody, will be back with future episodes of the Owl Factor. Please share this, like it, and do everything you can to bring attention to the incredibly important nexus between leadership and trust. Sally, thank you so much. And we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, Oliver.